Welcome to another episode of Prime and Load. On the night of September 29th, 1745, Frederick the Great and his army of approximately 22,000 men encamp in the Bohemian countryside. With the weather getting cooler and the campaign season coming to a close, Frederick prepares orders for his army to move back towards the Silesian border and enter winter quarters. But when the sun comes up on September 30th, it reveals guns on the height above the Prussian camp. During the night, an Austrian army of almost 45,000 moved in and now sits ready to strike. In today's episode, we explore how Frederick the Great and his army attempt to claw their way out of the jaws of defeat. My name is Lee Gugino. I'm joined by Doctors Alex Burns and Andrew Bamford. Thank you for joining us for the Battle of Soor. I know this is probably not an engagement that at least our American audience is probably very familiar with. So can you kind of give us a description of the situation that this conflict is involved in?
Yeah, absolutely. So this happens in the War of Austrian Succession, or as people in German might more accurately say, the Second Silesian War. Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia, has re-entered the conflict against Austria. That's part of that broader War of Austrian Succession. For listeners who are faithful and are kind of listening to the podcast in order, you'll remember that we did an episode about the Battle of Hohenfriedeburg earlier in the year. This is kind of like the sequel to that. So that battle occurred in June. This is continuing, picking up that story. The next large engagement of that war that happens on September 30th, 1745. So Frederick and company, having successfully defended the province of Silesia, which is in modern sort of southern Poland, they are now moving down into what we today think of as the Czech Republic, what was then the provinces of Bohemia and Moravia, and launching an offensive very close to the county of Glatz. There's a large city called Trachtenau. And so basically, kind of like Robert E. Lee in the Gettysburg campaign, often people who think about Gettysburg are like, oh, he's going after Harrisburg, he's trying to, annihilate the army and take D.C. Robert E. Lee's actual objective in the Battle of Gettysburg was move my army out of Northern Virginia so I can eat the enemy's fodder as opposed to eating like the fodder in my territory. And so Frederick is doing something very similar here at the Battle of Soor. He's moved his army out of Silesia into Bohemia in order to consume forage to make it more difficult for the enemy to launch a offensive operation into his territory in the following year. So for a commander who, again, people who love Frederick like to say he's dynamic and always aggressive and he's always going after the enemy army, this is a very traditional kind of cautious strategy, would have been very standard in 18th century warfare. And so Frederick is basically eating up, with an army of about 20,000 men, eating up all of the food in the region and slowly working his way back towards his own territory in order to create logistical headaches for the enemy in the next campaign season. That's the sort of strategy that he's pursuing. Obviously, the Austrians don't like this. They want to push him back over onto his side of the border and maybe preserve some of that fodder that the Prussians are consuming.
And so you said this is the Second Silesian War, and that is a conflict, just so we're understanding. We have the War of Austrian Succession, and this is sort of a theater of that larger conflict. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So if you think about World War II, right, it's like you got World War II is the overall umbrella term, and then you have the European theater of operations, the Pacific theater of operations. In the War of Austrian Succession, much like World War II, there's fighting all across the world. The Second Silesian War is a part of that conflict, particularly the Prussians and the Austrians, and also the Saxons are involved in a small way in this battle. They were very present at Hohenfriedeburg. They'll be present again at the Battle of Kesselsdorf at the end of the year. There's a small Saxon contingent helping out the Austrians here at Soor.
Okay, and Hohenfriedeburg is the previous engagement that happened, and then Soor comes after that. Is that directly after that, or is there some more time and more engagements between the two?
I mean, there are small skirmishes that happen, but this is the next kind of like the Battle of Gettysburg was followed or was preceded by the Battle of Chancellorsville. The Battle of Soor was preceded by the Battle of Hohenfriedeburg. So it's the next major engagement that where both main armies square off in combat.
And you mentioned Frederick. Can you tell us a little bit about the Austrian commanders that are at play here?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's not a major Saxon commander because there's just a few Saxon battalions involved in this battle. But the army command on the Austrian side is held by a man named Prince Charles of Lorraine. And Prince Charles of Lorraine is probably not going to win anyone's top commander of the 18th century bracket anytime soon. He is basically there because he is like the double brother-in-law of Maria Theresa. His brother married Maria Theresa, and then he married Maria Theresa's sister. So there's a lot of intermarriage between these two families. And it's kind of hard to fire your brother-in-law, even if he's not a great general. And so as a result, despite the fact that Charles is not covering himself in glory in this war of Austrian succession, he still remains in command. He's even going to be an important commander in the later 7 Years' War, where he squares off against Frederick at battles like the Battle of Leuthen in 1757.
And the armies that they are commanding, can you give us kind of a breakdown of the disposition of both forces?
Certainly. So there are just shy of 20,000. In total, the Prussians have 22,000, but only about 20,000 available for the battle. Sort of directly present and ready to fight. The Austrians, by contrast, have just shy of like 40,000. So it's almost a battle in which there are, it's a 2-to-1 force ratio against the Prussians. The Austrians have brought a much larger army to bear. The Prussian army has been parceling itself out in detachments, trying basically to forage, trying to sort of send men out to gather supplies in more distant areas. And Frederick later in his career kind of criticizes himself for this and says, man, I really reduced the main strength of my army to a point where it was too weak. That's why the enemy came up to try and attack me, because they knew my force was not very large.
If I could just jump in, Alex, on while we're talking about the armies, and previously about Hohenfriedeburg, I mean, to what extent has that previous battle cast a shadow over this? I mean, I can well imagine Charles being unwilling to risk another toe-to-toe match with Frederick. Some of the Austrian regiments were absolutely hammered in the first battle and are present again, which I would imagine doesn't do their morale or effectiveness a great deal of good. And similarly, the Prussians presumably have been given quite the morale boost by their victory. Does that play into things to help redress the numbers balance?
Yeah, I think to some extent. I don't think Prince Charles of Lorraine would have taken this offensive unless he had a sort of a fairly large numerical superiority on his side. And I do think that Frederick is almost fallen into a sense of complacency. They've won a huge battle. They're on the enemy's territory. This is factoring into his decision to, I think, parcel his numbers out and not take the threat very seriously. In fact, when he getting ready to go to sleep on the 29th of September, the evening before this battle, he's writing orders and preparing to move the army back north in the direction of Trachtenau and the Silesian border. So he is basically thinking, this campaigning year is done. There's not going to be another major battle. And as a result of that force disparity, Prince Charles of Lorraine, who probably wants a rematch. You don't want to be remembered as the guy who kept getting beat up by Frederick the Great all the time. And so, he thinks this is a golden opportunity to approach the Prussian position in the night and kind of surprise them very early in the morning on September 30th.
Hey everyone, Lee here for the Prime and Load team. We're passionate about exploring 18th century history and tactics and bringing those stories to you. But we need your help to grow our ranks. Please share this episode with a fellow history buff, leave a review where you can, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Most of all, join our email list. It gets you updates and insights into what's coming. You can join by using the link in this episode's description below. Thanks for listening, and now let's get back to the episode. Alex has mentioned it a few times. If you're interested, the Battle of Hohenfreiburg, we did an episode about it. It's episode 9. So if you haven't listened to that one yet, listen to that one. It isn't necessary for them to understand Hohenfreiburg to enjoy this episode, correct, Alex?
No, but I mean, you're getting the whole story. I mean, by the time that we get to December and do an episode on the Battle of Kesselsdorf, you basically like a trilogy of battles of the Prussian army in 1745. You can sort of listen to it all together if you want. But yeah, I think there are themes throughout all three of these battles that we'll kind of draw on today and when we talk about Kesselsdorf.
Awesome. So we've talked about the situation of this engagement. Can you kind of give us an orientation of the ground that's actually going to take place on? What are the key terrain features? Where are we on our map?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to sort of include a map, with this, at least maybe when we send it out in email to folks. But imagine the Prussian army sort of camped in a line facing south. They're in fairly mountainous terrain, close to the borderland between Silesia and Bohemia. There are small mountains there. You're in kind of the foothills of those mountains. It's fairly wooded. It's not really open agricultural terrain. Imagine sort of foothills, paths running up and down these hills. So the Prussian army is camped facing south. They have a sort of woods all around them. There's a large wood to the south. The Königsreichwald is sort of further to the south on kind of the southern end of the operational area. There are some villages on prominent rises directly in front of the Prussian army, particularly the village of Staudenz is there, kind of directly. The Prussians call this the Camp of Staudenz because it's kind of near this village. Off to the west, from the Prussian perspective, kind of over to their right, you have some more villages. The villages of Berkersdorf, a village that's kind of growing. There's like a tavern there now. But a wood again off to the right, off to the west, and another major sort of ridge and series of sort of prominences in that wood that's capped to the northwest by a big like ridge and hill called the Granekoppe. And this is the sort of piece of terrain that dominates the battlefield at Berkersdorf. For the next 150 years, German people will call this Battle Hill. It's a very very important piece of terrain that if you're up on top of the Granekoppe, you can basically see in all directions. You know what's going on. The Prussian position is kind of down in a valley to the east of this prominent rise. They can see the Granekoppe. The Granekoppe can sort of look down and see them. And when Frederick goes to bed on the 29th, as far as he's aware, there are no Austrian units in the direct vicinity. He's skirmishing with kind of Croats in the outposts, but there's not a major threat that he is aware of that's kind of leading into this battle. Up to sort of behind the Prussian army, there's a road running to the city of Trachtenau. That is the major route that goes back into Prussian territory in Silesia. So you can't, if you're Frederick, you can't lose contact with that Trachtenau road, because then you'll be cut off in hilly mountainous terrain. Your army will be surrounded. There'll be no way to get back into friendly territory that doesn't involve going through enemy positions. And so, sort of Frederick is aware of all this stuff. He wants to start moving the army back onto his own territory, back up towards the north. But it's, again, if the stereotype is all 18th century battles happen in like open golf courses, it's really not true, right? This is a very hilly, forested battlefield with a lot of kind of ravines and sort of creeks and ponds flowing through it. In some ways, it doesn't look like, Appalachia in the United States, but it is quite hilly by the standards of Central Europe.
Awesome. And you touched on it a little bit, but can you give us kind of a mission statement for both of these commanders? What are they trying to achieve?
Yeah, so Frederick, that's a great question. He doesn't even know yet, because he doesn't even know the battle's happening at this point, right? He when he goes to bed on September 29th, his only goal is get the army back to Trachtenau to sort of go back into Silesia for winter quarters. His opponent, Prince Charles of Lorraine, wants to approach and hopefully annihilate the Prussian army. He's got Croats that are attacking, or at least harassing, the Prussian position from the east. He's going to bring a large army of about 40,000 men up from the west and hopefully smash the Prussian army like a sandwich. This is his goal. He's going to appear in front of the Prussian positions early in the morning. With any luck, this is, I mean, for American listeners, imagine like what happens at Chancellorsville in the American Civil War. It's going to be an early morning attack. You're going to storm the Prussian camp with bayonets. It's going to be a slaughter. Maybe you'll be able to snuff out the entire Prussian army in one decisive stroke.
Awesome. And I don't want to derail us too much, but you're talking about these Croats who are off on the side. Can you give us a brief description about who are they and what makes them specifically good for this?
Yeah, absolutely. So Croats are, Grenzer are troops from the Austrian military borderland. They're the light troops of the Austrian army. They're really good at harassing Prussian positions. I mean, for American listeners, think of troops like riflemen or Jaeger from the American sort of War of Independence. They're not going to probably overrun the enemy position with a frontal attack, but they're great at kind of harassing your opponent, keeping them off balance, keeping Frederick, I think realistically at this battle, from really operationally knowing exactly what's going on, denying the enemy intelligence. That's what these Croats or these Grenza are doing for the Austrians at Soor. And there's about 5,000 of them, give or take. So all told, including the Croats, the Austrians have maybe 45,000 men. The Prussians, all told, including all their outposts, we have 22,000 men. It's a real disparity of numbers. Frederick's in a very dangerous position.
Okay, and that he doesn't know he's in yet.
He doesn't know he's in it. It makes it even more dangerous, right? Yeah.
So the Austrians are denying him that vision of the battle space while they move up to try and overwhelm him, like you said, almost a Chancellorsville sort of scenario. Tell us how this thing starts. So we've got Frederick being denied vision of the battle space. The Austrians are coming up at night, you said, right? So they've got the advantage of darkness.
Yeah, they're marching through the night on the 29th. At about 5 a.m., the Frederick has assembled his general officers to give them the orders to move the army to Traitenau, like the specific disposition. So reenactors take note, officers' call should really be at 5 a.m., but that's either here or there. While this kind of officer's call is going on, an aide to one of the Prussian generals rides up and basically says, there's a large Austrian army that's appeared to the west. And so Frederick hears this. He immediately grabs one of the drummers from the guard battalion that he's camped in front of, and orders that drummer to basically to beat assembly. So a lot of the Prussian period sources describe our first symbol that something was wrong on the morning of the Battle of Soor was we heard one drummer beating the assembly, and so the Prussian army kind of shakes itself out of its tents, trying to figure out what's going on. Frederick and the son of Leopold Anhalt-Dessau, the hereditary prince of Anhalt-Dessau, another one of his important generals, they go immediately, they get on their horses, they go to reconnoiter where the Austrian army is to their west. And Frederick goes, and he sees that on this ridge that's running south to north, and sort of crowned by the Granakoppa at the northern end, this was the biggest, highest prominence, there's a large Austrian army that he estimates, incorrectly, but he estimates at about 32,000 men. So in Frederick's mind, he's been outflanked by an Austrian army that's half again as large as his. This is a very, very serious moment. He's observing the Austrian position via a telescope. He sees that there are sort of large batteries of cannon that are controlling the road to Traitenau, and that's his army's basically escape route out of this operational area. And so he knows this is a very dangerous position. He'll write after the battle, sort of colloquially, I was in soup up to my ears. So this is a very, very dangerous moment for Frederick. In some ways, I think very much like a Hochkirch, for American listeners, a Union army at Chancellorsville. This is a crisis point, and how Frederick responds to this, I think, gives us a sense of what he's like as a commander.
Can I just jump in there, Alex? Because you read some accounts of Soor, and it almost suggests that Charles and the Austrians fluffed it slightly by holding actually what you've described as a very advantageous position, blocking that key road. But the suggestion is perhaps that they should have kept coming. They should have attacked the Prussians in the camp, very much akin to what happened at Hochkirch. I mean, was that an error in your opinion? Should they have pressed forward, or were they wise doing what they did?
Yeah, probably so. So that, Andrew, is a question, and I don't hate Prince Charles of Lorraine. I don't think he's sort of like the McClellan of the the War of Austrian Succession or something like this. But it's to do with the weather and the sort of the physical environment. So this is early in the morning yet. I mean, by now we're probably at 6 a.m. And it's a very foggy morning in late September in Bohemia. And so the sun has burned off the fog on that ridge line so that the Prussians, looking up, can see the Austrian positions up on the ridge line. But the Austrians, Prince Charles of Lorraine, looking down from the Granatkoppe, can't see exactly where the Prussian army is camped in the valley below it. So, yes, it was probably an error not to immediately come bombing down the hill with bayonets and try to overrun the Prussian position while they were encamped. But in Prince Charles's defense, he can't see that position. He doesn't know if the whole Prussian army is waiting for him to attack. And so he's kind of, depending on who you believe, hoping that fog will burn off, or hoping that the Croats will begin an attack and they'll kind of do the hard work and sort of figure out where exactly the enemy is before he moves his army down the hill. So I think it was a fatal moment of kind of hesitation, but there are reasons that drive that hesitation that prevent Prince Charles of Lorraine from saying, "Oh, this is a slam dunk. Let's go down and nab the Prussian army while it's sleeping." They don't know exactly where the Prussians are because of this heavy blanket of fog that's covering the valley.
And so, what happens next?
So Frederick makes a very important decision. You can't get out while the enemy is basically covering the road with cannons. And so the only way to survive this is to try and defeat the Austrian army that is kind of outflanked you. And again, hopefully you found a map of what we're talking about. Imagine sort of a T that's fallen over on its left side. The Austrian army is the cross of that T, and the Prussian army is kind of perpendicularly to it is the beam of that T. So the Prussians, having shaken themselves out of their camp, Frederick says we need to move the sort of divisions of the army from sort of right to left over to attack the Austrian position on the Granatkoppe. We've got to move our right to engage their left. And so he issues orders for Prussian cavalry wing on the right end of the Prussian army closest to the Austrian position to move up and around to the north, kind of right under the path of the Austrian artillery battery in order to engage their opposite number. And he also prepares 11 battalions of the right infantry wing of the army to sort of start launching an assault on the Granatkoppe. And so much like the engagement we talked about at Hohenfriedeburg, you have different wings of the Prussian army approaching the enemy position perpendicularly and kind of coming online and engaging as they reach the enemy position. So it's an attack that begins on the northern end of the battlefield and much like Hohenfriedeburg, will kind of work its way down towards the south as the day continues.
That sounds like a very difficult maneuver to get done, especially with a bunch of troops that are in the fog coming out of their tents and trying to figure out their orientation.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the key part of it here is kind of they're helped by the fog. At least initially, the Prussians can see the Austrians, but the Austrians can't really see them. And so Frederick is able to, and he holds stabbing very quickly. Something else comes through in the sources. The king's given you like the 5-minute pre-combat brief. It's not a huge detailed disposition. That'll become important later in the story. But the cavalry, they move up sort of around the Granite Copper. They come out of the fog. They start getting really heavily hit by round shot and eventually canister from this large battery of heavy guns that the Austrians have planted on the Granite Copper. And then they move in to attack their opposite number, the Austrian cavalry wing, which is on the northern end of the battlefield, kind of on the northwestern end of this ridge or this prominence, the Granite Copper. And so the first major engagement, the first part of this battle is Prussian cavalry charging up against Austrian cavalry, their opposite number, and the Prussians are outnumbered, and they're charging basically from a valley. They're charging up a hill towards enemy cavalry on the top of the hill. So this is not a great position to be in. I mean, Frederick has he's in soup up to his ears, right? He's in a real pickle tactically. You don't want to have to. I mean, not just tactically, in every way. Operationally, he's sort of cut off from where he's trying to go. Tactically, he's got to go now assault an enemy in a hilltop position in order to get himself out of this operational bind. It's a very dangerous moment. The Prussian cavalry goes forward. Here they are very fortuitously helped out of this situation by a kind of a poor tactical decision making on the local level. The Austrian cavalry, seeing the Prussian squadrons coming up the hill towards them, decide the best way to disrupt the Prussian advance would not to be sort of charge down the hill towards them, but instead to open fire with carbines and pistols. And so from standing sort of on their horses, the Austrian cuirassiers and dragoons are sort of opening fire with their carbines as the Prussian cavalry is ascending the hill. And certainly Prussian cavalrymen are killed. A lot of them are killed by the artillery fire as they're coming in. But they make that contact at speed. They really get up in. There's a swirling melee, and much like at the Battle of Hohenfriedeburg, in this swirling melee, they kind of push the Austrian cavalry off the prominence that they're on and back into the woods behind the prominence, where there's kind of like a furball scrum with cavalry going on for like the next hour or so before the both sides kind of break off and reform, and as usually happens, are kind of out of the rest of the battle.
But that cavalry fight, does it affect the artillery on the position?
No. So there's still a huge number of heavy artillery pieces that are there on the Granite Kampfe, in addition to 15 companies of Austrian grenadiers that are sort of defending this position, and I think 10 battalions of Austrian infantry that are all on the Granite Kampfe. I mean, the Prussian cavalry, as they're charging in, they're getting flanking fire from these forces that they're sort of charging by. So it's a very dangerous charge. It because of this decision to sort of halt and fire with carbines on the Austrian side, the Prussians are able to win this. But Frederick's main headache, the fact that there's a large enemy battery on the Granite Kampfe, is still there. These cannons are still controlling the route out of the operational area, and so Frederick is going to have to get rid of that that position if the battle's going to continue.
That seems like a really tough position to try and send a cavalry detachment against. Was Frederick's goal really to eliminate that position, or was it more of we have to engage in something now, kind of a decent plan's better than no plan sort of situation?
Yeah, I think his immediate. I mean, he's like, we've got to attack, otherwise the army's gonna be destroyed. So that's kind of his initial gut reaction. You probably don't want to send an infantry attack forward against the Granite Kampfe with enemy cavalry waiting right there. So this is a way of trying to kind of maybe muddy the operational environment on the Austrian side and maybe take one of their pieces out of play before you try to assault that main position, which is in really some ways the heart of the Battle of Soor.
So he's definitely much more prepping the position, but instead of trying to actually achieve a little victory up there.
Yeah, I would say so. And okay. I mean, again, much like many 18th century cavalry battles, there's a scrum after everybody gets tired, both sides kind of peel off, staring at each other. There's not a huge decisive resolution, even if the Prussians kind of get the better of this fight.
Okay. And so what does Frederick do, or the Austrians do after this engagement?
Yeah, so the next move, the cavalry's come online, they've attacked, that's going all right. Frederick's next move is to send forward 6 battalions of infantry to try and push the position on the Granikopfa. And this is one of those, great, quote-unquote, moments in Prussian military history that you remembered into the 19th century and the 20th century. These 6 battalions consist of 3 grenadier battalions on the sort of northern or the right end of the line, and then the sort of southern or the left end of the line is 3 battalions of the Anhalt regiment, which is like Leopold von Anhalt-Dessau's like model regiment for the army. So essentially, Frederick's decision is send the elite shock troops forward to try and force the position. And so the infantry come in. They're advancing with shouldered firearms. The Prussians believe, as many armies believe in the mid-18th century, the best way to take ground is advance into close range without firing, because then the intimidation of having a fresh volley loaded in your muskets delivered at close range will cause the enemy to give ground. And so this is the plan. The regiments go into the attack, and they're getting absolutely decimated by blasts of canister that are coming out of this battery of heavy cannon. And so as they go forward, they get within about 150 meters of the enemy position, and it's too much for the men. They can't keep going forward. The advance stalls, and primary sources are clear, actually, saying, like, without orders, the men just began to fire. So it's a breakdown in the advance. The Prussian infantry have stalled in the face of this heavy artillery, and the grenadier and musketeers, or fusilier, I guess, for the Austrian support. It's a firefight develops, and the Austrians, with the benefit of high ground and a heavy artillery battery, get the better of this firefight. The Prussian sources say, depending on which source you read, they shot away all their cartridges. So the Prussian infantry down kind of on the slope, approaching this hilltop position, fire through 60 rounds. They then decide, there's not a lot we can do. We've got to fall back. And so, if you're Frederick, this is a very dangerous moment. Your best troops in the army have gone forward and basically been annihilated. I want to tell you the story of one grenadier battalion that's on the northern end of this line. It's the Wedel Grenadier Battalion. It goes into action on the morning of the 30th of September with something like 358 soldiers. Or 358 common soldiers. All together, it's a little more than that if you include the officers, the NCOs, the musicians. They go into action, and they take over 260 casualties. So I did the math last night. If you compare the losses that or you do the math, it's an 82% loss rate. 82% of the battalion is essentially annihilated in the course of this fight. About 180 of them are killed, but about 100 of them are wounded. This is a loss, again, for American listeners, grasping for something maybe a little bit more familiar. This is the same exact loss rate that 1st Minnesota suffers at the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, an 82% loss rate in the course of this attack. So it is a disaster these are the elite troops, the best troops in the Prussian army going forward to the attack. They've been knocked back. It's a great moment if you're a fan of Maria Theresa. It's a horrifying moment if you're Frederick there watching your best troops basically get annihilated by this heavy artillery. And so, with the first 6 battalions kind of falling back in disorder, the Prussian then go forward with the second line. You have that sort of question that I often get asked by wargamers. Does interpenetration of lines ever happen in the 18th century? Does the first line of battle ever fall back through the second line of battle? And yes, it does. We have Prussian sources that say, the second line pauses and there are gaps so that the survivors of the first line can pass back through. The second line goes forward, but they don't try to, storm the position with shouldered muskets. They decide to open fire at a longer range, but by platoons. And they're kind of saved, not necessarily by the skill of Prussian platoon fire, but by the fact that, kind of exuberant from their victory, several companies of Austrian grenadiers have advanced down the hill after the shattered remnants of that first line. Now, the first line is also reforming. They're getting cartridges from the wounded men on the ground. They'll eventually rejoin the action. So it'll be 11 battalions. Some pretty much gone at that point, going into the fight later on. But these Austrian grenadiers who have gone out, en avant, Maria Theresa vivat. They're very pumped up. They are masking the heavy artillery battery, and so the canister that has been so vital in knocking back the first wave of the assault, you can't. I mean, I guess if you're fake Charles Cornwallis, because he didn't actually do this at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, you could fire a canister through your own troops, but the Austrian gunners don't, and so it's the artillerymen who are there. Make this decision. The grenadiers have masked their fire. The Prussian second wave assault comes up. They're able to push the Austrian grenadiers back. They're able to come through, take this battery of heavy artillery that's been masked, and slowly kind of work the enemy off of the Granakopf. So it's again, tragically, if you're a Maria Theresa fan, it's this decision to go forward, pursue the enemy, that actually leads to the very strong position on the Granakopf falling to the Prussian advance.
Awesome. And backing up just a little bit, a few times you mentioned the Prussians they're engaging in platoon firing at longer ranges. What kind of longer ranges are we talking about? Are they more than 150, 200 yards?
That's a great question. So I guess I would say I have not seen sources from this battle that give us a particular count. Alexander Kerengasser describes the Prussians firing by platoons at Kesselsdorf, and they're doing it like 800 yards. So I don't necessarily think that's what's happening here. We know that in the initial advance of those 6 battalions, when they stop the movement towards that heavy artillery battery, they're 150 yards away. So that's a pretty normal firefight distance of the 18th century. Just shooting from the hip, it wouldn't shock me if that kind of range was a little bit closer to what we're talking about. And obviously, once the officers are able to, like Ferdinand Brunswick, are able to reassert control of the situation, they're leading the men into very close range to attack with bayonets. That is really the deciding point of the battle. But yeah, it's a battle that's kind of marked by a desire on the part of the officers to go up and engage in in close attack, whereas the men, both on the northern end of the battlefield and to some extent on the southern end of the battlefield, they say, maybe we should fire from a longer range and be a little bit safer. Something that matches pretty well with data that we see from all across the 18th century.
And can you kind of describe if it's possible, if we have sources for it, the fight in the woods? Because woods fighting is not typically what we think of in this time period, especially kind of in, this setting.
Yeah, absolutely. Does it break down just into like every man sort of fighting for themselves?
Yeah.
That's a really good question, and the sources don't speak explicitly to that, but the comment, the Austrians are forming from prominence to prominence, indicates there's some degree of organization still occurring. I mean, it's you're fighting up and down ravines and in sort of wooded terrain, so the lines are probably broken up a little bit, but it probably looks a little bit more like a firefight in the American War of Independence than it might, we might immediately think of as looking like the Norman Europe. But it's also kind of a running battle. It's a pursuit. It looks like at least on the Austrian side, the kind of lines of battalions are intermixed. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if it's a bit more broken up, and the men are less under control than we usually think of in sort of the standard image of 18th century warfare.
I realise, Alex, it's a sideline from the battle proper, but of course this is the action where famously the Austrians capture Frederick's baggage and kidnap his pet dog, which we've not long marked International Dog Day. So
Yes.
Could you expand on that part of the story?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think maybe we should just have a whole episode on 18th century warfare with dogs.
Absolutely.
So Frederick keeps like whippets or Italian greyhounds. They're his favorite kind of dog, and he has a particularly beloved whippet named Bisha, and she is with the baggage train. And so the Prussians are kind of winning the battle, and some Austrian light troops think, this is a great moment to raid the Prussian baggage train. So they go in and take. I think he writes after the battle saying like, I literally have nothing but the clothes on my back anymore. They take all the king's stuff, and in the course of taking the king's stuff, they find his dog, and so they take the dog. And I think Frederick's mind, these and this is me being funny, not obviously a serious comment, but these Croatian savages have eaten my dog. What's happened here? Well, the dog's actually been taken into custody by one of the Austrian generals, a general named Nadasti, and specifically his wife. Like he gives the dog to her. And it is part of the peace negotiations. Like, hey, can we have the king's dog back, please? Like, can we manage to get Bisha returned? And she is. At the end of this conflict, we're getting ahead of ourselves here because we've got to talk about Kesselsdorf yet this year. Maybe we'll have a day where we just kind of wrap up the War of Austrian Succession. One of the Prussian officers kind of opens the door and like lets Bisha run in, and she jumps up on the table and puts her paws up on Frederick's soldiers. Of course, he's big soft and he's crying. It's a very very wonderful moment for all the dog lovers out there, and I think there's a great. It's a story that's been told in isolation in both Europe and North America, but this happens with Bisha, and then also you have General William Howe has a dog in the American War of Independence that accidentally follows the Americans back from the Battle of Germantown, ends up being taken prisoner by the American army. And so there is absolutely sort of like a how do we return the enemy's dog, narrative going throughout 18th century warfare. That's what I'm saying. Maybe we should do a whole episode on this. I think the Patriot kind of riffs on this when they take Cornwallis's dogs in the Patriot, and of course the dogs are won over by Freedom and Apple Pie and Eagles, and so when Mel Gibson whistles, they come running out of the townhouse after him. But in reality, George Washington sends General Howe's dog back with a nice note. Hey General Howe, here you lost this dog, and the Austrians eventually give Bisha back to the Frederick and the Prussians. So don't worry, all the dogs are saved by the time the 18th century story of their role in 18th century warfare comes to an end. Yeah.
I mean, heartwarming dog stories aside, and I love a heartwarming dog story as much as anybody. But is that a misuse of the Austrian light troops? I mean, should they really have been harassing the flank of the Prussian attack rather than going off looking for booty? It seems.
Yeah, but I mean, what kind of light troops would they be if they weren't looking for a little booty?
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit in Sharp where one of the guys kind of like a land pirate, and I mean I think that's a bit rough, and obviously light troops are an incredibly important both battlefield and operational asset in the 18th century. But I mean you don't join a Freikorps because you're a upstanding individual who's never looking to plunder a little bit, right? I mean, how else can you expect to get rich? So yeah, I guess Prince Charles is probably a little bit frustrated that the Croatians don't attack the rear of the Prussian army, and makes it, this is one of his like, hey, don't fire me please excuses for the outcome of the Battle of Soor. But German historians in the later 19th and 20th century make I think, a fairly good point. Frederick leaves like 5 grenadier battalions and some hussars to. It's not like it's like the back of the army is there, the Croatians can go attack. There's a significant Prussian force kind of keeping an eye on this Croatian element that is coming up from the east. And so again, in this way, I think it is very, very much like the Battle of Chancellorsville, right? Because in this fight, Hooker goes over onto the offensive and takes most of the army across to try and basically attack Lee from the west, while Sedgwick and a small part of the army stay in Fredericksburg, kind of holding their position. But then Hooker starts sending messages back to Sedgwick like, hey, you should launch an attack. Like, we're kind of all tapped out here. The holding force needs to become the kind of hammer of this attack. I think Prince Charles's point is very similar to that. He's got 40,000 men against 19,000 Prussians, and he's expecting the 5,000 Croatians to kind of pull it out of the bag. I think it's a little bit disingenuous, and maybe I'm putting my cards on the table too much. I don't think Prince Charles of Lorraine is a great commander. It almost worked. I mean, Dawn will finally get there at Hawkirk in like 13 years. So, Prince Charles will have to wait for Frederick's comeuppance for a bit longer. But I think this is a battle that kind of doesn't show Frederick at his best, at least operationally, right? I mean, the enemy's able to get really close to you with a much larger force. They're able to get on your flank. They're able to restrict your operational escape route. The Prussian army kind of covers itself in glory in like a tactical level, if you're not one of those poor guys from Wedel getting slaughtered by heavy artillery. But that I think in some ways taps into a grand Prusso-German military tradition, which is let's get ourselves into a horrible place strategically and operationally, and sort of tactics our way out of it, which is not really what you want to be doing in an ideal world. Frederick, I think, once he's in this pickle, he comes to the right conclusion. That is, we've got to fight our way out, otherwise we're sunk. That's still kind of asking your army to do a lot, and the Prussian army is able to do that. But in some ways, I do think Frederick might learn the wrong lessons from this battle, which is we can just go up and attack the enemy on high ground when they outnumber us by a good margin and win anyway. That's not going to always work out, and it doesn't work out in the 7 Years' War. I mean, it sort of kind of works at Lobositz, and then it absolutely all goes sideways at Kolin in 1757. So Frederick's faith in an incredible army, I don't think it's misplaced, but you're already losing a lot of really important and good officers, even in the War of Austrian Succession. So the normal narrative of Prussian military history is the Prussian army is kind of used up by the end of the 7 Years' War. I think the Prussian high command suffers a lot of losses in the War of Austrian Succession. And so you could maybe chart a decline in quality even by the time you get into the early part of the 7 Years' War, not necessarily on the level of individual soldiers or battalions or something like this, but just in terms of the very young and promising officers who are killed in these battles. They probably would have been very, very nice to have them in some of the fights in the 7 Years' War. Because the army is attacking in this risky manner, kind of uphill against superior odds.
So if we look at kind of the big outcomes of this battle, it's kind of sounding like for the Prussians is that they just don't get crushed in camp. Is that correct?
That's great. This is like a hopeful masterstroke where Prince Charles is going to come in and get rid of Frederick and end the war in one morning, and that doesn't happen.
And so for the Austrians, it's really just it's kind of all bad. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, they lose about 1,000 men as prisoners of war. They lose about 6,000 men, as casualties. You're killed and wounded together. It's not a great moment, and it sort of ends the hope that they're going to be able to resume the offensive and retake Silesia. And so now, the really only major question that's sort of left is, can the Saxons put enough pressure on the Prussian army to kind of keep this fight going? What will happen in that part of Germany? And we'll probably answer that question more fully when we talk and hopefully have Alexander Kirngasser on to talk about the Battle of Kesselsdorf later on in the year. But yeah, I mean, if you're on the Prussian side, this battle is hey, never bad to win a battle, right? But it's certainly not a planned battle like Hohenfriedberg. I mean, if you read Frederick's proclamations of thanksgiving to the armies after each of these battles, like I did last night, you'll see the one at Hohenfriedberg is like incredibly long. It's like showering the troops with praise. He's very impressed. Soor is more like, hey, thanks guys. Yeah, that was great. I'm glad you guys won that one. Woo. It's like a paragraph long as opposed to this long and flowery and flowing tribute for winning the Battle of Hohenfriedberg. I mean, to some extent, the Soor is that was great. Let's get back into Silesia. I mean, that could have gone badly. And I think I'm being down on Frederick here because he deserves a bit of that. But this is a very dangerous moment. He's able to work his way out of it. It's again, in my opinion, this is one of those interesting battles of the entirety of the the Frederican period. It shows an army in adversity, being surprised early in the morning, outnumbered 2-1. I mean, in most other situations in military history, this would be like, oh, slam dunk, it's over. And the Prussians are still able to kind of fight their way out of this bag. And so as a result, I think, love him or hate him, and I go back and forth. I think Frederick probably deserves some level of respect. Certainly his troops deserve some level of respect for their performance at Soor. Oh, and just one final plug. The one of the great moments in this fight is the Grenadiers of the 13th and 37th sort of converged Grenadier Battalion. They're in the second line, sort of going up this to attack this battery of cannon. It is, I mean, just imagine if you're in part of one of the second line on the northern end of the battlefield in the Prussian side, you've just seen the best troops in the army get annihilated, and you still kind of go forward and attack and the attack saves the army. So in my opinion, this is really kind of the crisis of the battle. Could have swung either way. Once this first attack gets knocked back, I mean, you can only imagine, like, Frederick's eyes are probably getting, like, big as saucer plates, right? They're already fairly large. I mean, it's just the amount of, intestinal fortitude that it takes for these guys in the second line to be like, well, the best guys got slaughtered. We're the B team. Let's go up and see what we can do. I mean, it's very impressive and something that kind of stands out to me when I look at Soor.
Alex, do you want to give us some resources for anybody who's interested in Soor specifically, or maybe some more of the campaigns or the commanders?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a tough one because there's not a lot out there on Soor in English. So if you read German, I would say definitely look at the general staff history. Definitely look at Hans Stabenau's dissertation, just called The Battle of Soor, Die Schlacht bei Soor. But if you don't read German, I imagine most of our listeners don't, and nothing wrong with that, then I would say Christopher Duffy's Military Life of Frederick the Great is still probably the best place to go. for Soor. There's a good description of the overall campaign that we're discussing, and also the battle in that book. You could also look at military life of Frederick the Great. But honestly, as we've gone through recording these episodes, Lee, I think one of the things that stuck out to me is there really aren't a lot of great English language resources on these battles in the War of Austrian Succession. Obviously, no disrespect to Alex Kirengosser, who's produced an incredible study of the Battle of Kesselsdorf, but that's one battle out of a series of large battles in the War of Austrian Succession. We really need more historians to sort of focus on these battles from an operational and tactical perspective, and update our telling of these fights for a 21st century audience. So yeah, I would say get Military Life of Frederick the Great if you don't already have it, but also hopefully someone young listening to this podcast will be inspired to go out and write a great English language book on the Battle of Soor or the Battle of Hohenfriedeburg.
Murmurs in the camp was a term used by 18th century officers to describe the talk among soldiers in camp. What were the soldiers seeing, hearing, and what was it that they were actually talking about? In this show, we've tried to capture that idea at the end of our episodes. The problem is we've been leaving out the most important part. You, the troops. So we're restructuring our Murmurs in the Camp section of our show. At the end of every Prime and Load episode, we're going to take some time to hear from you, our listeners, and answer some questions or talk about topics that you guys want to hear about. If you're interested in submitting a question or a talking point for the Murmurs in the Camp section of our show, call our voicemail box at 716-299-8426. You can also email us at primeandloadpodcast@gmail.com. Be sure to add your first name and where you're from so you can recognize your question. With that said, let's get to our Murmurs in the Camp.
Hi guys, this is wabjeshiakleo@gmail.com. Question for Dr. Burns. I'm a big fan of the Outlander series, and I know you used to post regularly about it. I'm curious if the Scottish warfare during the Jacobite Rebellion looks similar to what was shown in the series. Was it actually so, let's say, traditional/non-modern compared to the English?
So this is a great question, and I will say I'm not someone who focuses explicitly on the Jacobite rebellions in my research. So I'm gonna kind of try to give you my best answer with the secondary reading that I've done, and maybe a bit of research that has worked its way kind of in odds and ends to projects that I worked on. But I would say broadly, Outlander does, at least tries to make an effort to display both, I think, the Janus-faced nature of Jacobite warfare in the 18th century. There are scenes where the lead male character, whose I think name is James Fraser in the show, is trying to sort of drill soldiers in a more sort of standard European format, and then believe his uncle comes through and says, no, that's idiotic. We should just go right at him with broadswords like we have for, and we'll get up in their grill and cause them to panic and run away. And this is the better way to fight. As far as actual depictions of combat during the 45, I think the show leans more into the second option. So it doesn't show the way, say, the Jacobite army continue to try and do sort of more modern drill with firelocks. There are accounts, I believe, of even relatively late, by the time you get into 1746, of Highland units and Lowland units who are drilling, firing by platoons and divisions and practicing this sort of more modern style of war. And I will say, also, on the face of it, I don't, obviously the clan structure, how the Highland army fights, you could look at that and say, oh, this is very traditional. But if you look at, say you look at the Jacobites and how they fight, and compare that to the Swedish army and their guappa style of tactics in the Great Northern War, and even what the British army is trying to do to the American rebels in the American War of Independence, all of these armies, essentially their philosophy of war is, we're going to get into, relatively close range, depending on the battle, 100 yards maybe or less. We're going to fire a volley, and then we're going to use close combat weapons, be those bayonets, be those swords, and then try to sort of press home, intimidate the enemy, get them to break, get them to start to panic, and hopefully chase them off the battlefield, and if not, maybe be victorious in melee. This is not something that only quote unquote traditional Scottish soldiers are doing, or Highland warriors, maybe it'd be another way of looking at it, are doing in the 18th century. It's something that's done in maybe slightly different forms by the Swedish army, in the American War of Independence by the British army. With that said, there are scholars. I want to say the name of the scholar who I encountered the source in. His name is Murray Pittock. He has examined, I think, both battlefield archaeology, perhaps, and also returns of captured weapons from after Culloden. If you look at what the Jacobites actually were wielding at Culloden, a lot more muskets than swords. So the idea that if your whole image of the 45 is David Maurier's An Incident in the Late Rebellion, where the Jacobites are there with sort of the targe and the broadsword, that might not be exactly what it looked like. Even if you go into the realm of like wargaming figures, there are lots of Jacobites with swords and shields and lockbar axes, but they're maybe the majority of these troops were armed with muskets, or at the very least, the muskets are what was thrown down in the course of the battle as the Jacobites fled after Culloden. I would say, probably from my perspective, the Highland Army is a little bit more Janus-faced. Christopher Duffy's done a lot of work on the way that they're adopting a forward-thinking divisional system, perhaps based on the French experience in the 1740s. I would say in conversations with historians who study the French army that I've had in the States, maybe that idea is not as concrete as it first appears. But yeah, they're both forward-looking and maybe backward-looking in some ways, like most armies in the 18th century. Andrew, what would you add to that?
Just quickly on that last part, I think you're right about the divisional thing being overdone. Sorry to the shades of Professor Duffy, but I think on that one he might have taken an argument a little bit too far, perhaps. I have to say as well, and I know we've covered this in previous episodes as well, and the question refers specifically to the English, and we talked about this. It's not English for England versus Scotland. It was the British Army, and there were Scots regiments, Highland regiments in it. And so forth. I haven't seen the series. I subjected myself to some clips on YouTube. No sacrifice too great for our listeners. Wasn't. I tried the books. It wasn't my cup of tea, so I didn't give the series a go. By the looks of it, it's a nicely done drama. I watched the Culloden sequence, which there are points. Certainly, the clip I saw starts with an argument amongst the Jacobite high command. Well, that's dead accurate, because they fought like cats in a sack at times. I'm not quite sure a junior clan officer coming and telling Prince Charles that now's the time to charge, or else was quite the level of lèse-majesté that it got to. But and I certainly wouldn't want to be running around Drumossie Moor in my shirt in April. I think a lot of the Highland soldiers were rather underdressed for the actual weather conditions, but everybody wants to see the hero in his shirt, don't they? I watched the sequence as well, which I assume was Preston Pans, in as much as it was fought in a lot of mist, and that seemed fairly well done, but it didn't really pick up then from that to the Culloden sequence. It's still farm implements and this and that and the other. I don't think I saw a gun in the Preston Pans one, and certainly not very many of them in Highland hands in the Culloden one. So it's a shame, really, that they hadn't picked up on that evolution of the way the Highland Army fought in its brief existence. And I'm conscious we're going to do episodes on this. So I don't want to go into too much more detail, but. What else to say? I'm not sure. Setting the moor on fire at Culloden, that was weird because it was very soggy. So I don't know how they managed that. Well done, the resourceful British Army there. Nice backdrop, of course, for the grudge fight with the redcoat officer. I assume was the villain of the piece. So yeah, there were details that felt spot on. I mean, the bit where they're fighting dragoons would have been perfect for Falkirk because that did happen. They got into the midst of the Highlanders, and the Highlanders were pulling men off their horses and slashing at horses' bellies and the rest of it. But at Culloden, the government cavalry was fairly decisive in finishing off the rout of the Highlanders. So that seemed rather extreme. I mean, I loved the comment in fact the first comment I saw in the YouTube the comment section. There are more dead redcoats in this clip than there were in the whole of the real battle. I'm guessing our sympathies are meant to do with the Jacobites in this particular series, but it was perhaps a little bit overdone. So yeah, good drama, some nice notes, but some pretty iffy interpretations as well. But you don't let that spoil the fun if you're watching it for entertainment. It was Burrell's historically, yeah. I mean, God knows what these guys were wearing, but I wouldn't have attempted to guess a regiment from that.
So if we were to rate these battle scenes from like Mel Gibson's The Patriot to Russell Crowe's Master and Commander, where would we put this?
Is it like a 1 to 5? I rate the battles on 1 to 5. I would say Preston Pans was so misty, I had no idea what was really going on, so that was quite nice. I would give Culloden like maybe a 3. So in between the two.
Yeah, I think that seems fair from what I saw from the clips. It marks for trying, certainly. You can see where they were making the effort for things, and inevitably there's concessions with props and kit and so forth. That the regiment that made contact had yellow facings rather than blue for Burrell's, but hey, the wardrobe wardrobe budget's only going to stretch so far.
I'd probably give the what I've seen of the American War of Independence material culture and combat like a -5. So I mean, it's this is the for people who are just embarking on this 8-season series. This is the high point. The combat depictions in Outlander does not get better than the 1740s section. That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with a link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date on the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, formerly known as X. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino, music by Brianna Tam, Artie Sun, and Adrian Berenegger. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.